Welcome, everybody. This is, I don't remember how many of these we've done, but we've done a lot of these. We do an annual conference. It's called the SHIELD Conference, sponsored here at Nova Southeastern University, where we have focused so much of our work on Gulf War illness over these past years. SHIELD stands for Sustained Homeostatic Imbalance Due to Environmental Exposure, which is kind of a wordy thing, but it was really because, hey, you understand what SHIELD means, those of you that have served. But we're grateful to you. And every year we put on this conference for our veterans of the Gulf War and their families and the investigators and other people that really care a lot about the folks who suffer from Gulf War illness all these many years later, 34 years later. And it's, in essence, this is a gratitude conference. We're grateful. We're grateful for your service. We're grateful for your participation in our studies that have helped us learn so much. And I think that you'll see today and be encouraged that all that participation has led to great advances in our understanding of Gulf War illness. And if you were to look on clinicaltrials.gov or other sites that list studies, you will see dozens and dozens of studies that are focused, because we understand what the underpinnings of this illness are, on very precise mediators, not just the symptoms of the illness. So you feel, and you should feel, that study progresses slowly, because it does. Careful science does progress methodically and slowly. And of course, with our field, with the bumps of a pandemic and funding hiccups over the years that happened, but we're always fixed to your own advocacy as advocates and people who care about folks with Gulf War. So, but nonetheless, progress has happened. I'm excited about the progress, and that's what this meeting is about. So the idea here is that we're advancing knowledge through research. That means we're making things move. And there's two huge sources of funding that have helped us the most. One is advocacy-driven, congressionally directed medical research, the CDRMP program, which is a DoD funding, and that's where most of the money that has advanced to trials has been. And then the VA has also put some significant resources into understanding Gulf War and continues to do so. And so these are the two largest funding agencies. There are some NIH-funded work as well. There's been a little bit. I'm going to skip over us, though. We're a big and mighty team of folks trying to help you and talk more about Gulf War illness itself. This will look familiar to those of you who served. That's the middle of the day, noon, in the Gulf, with the oil fires causing this dense, black, thick, nasty stuff that you all were trying to breathe through and work in. That with another layer of many layers of toxic exposures, one of which was an actual sarin gas that was detonated on the successful completion of the active part of the war, but in a way that caused downwind exposures, low-grade exposures to this terrible organophosphate poison. And as well as other poisons that we see in our own day-to-day existence, but the military sees far more often, particularly in the form of pesticides and that sort of thing. So a lot of exposures that resulted in 1/3 of Gulf War veterans becoming chronically ill and with an illness that sustains now 30 plus years later. So that means something really important happened, and research has demonstrated exactly what happened. And I think Lee will talk more about that because she's done a lot of that work herself, and all the other speakers. So I don't have to tell you what Gulf War illness is. And part of the reason why it's hard to circle it well is because it's defined by its symptoms. There are a lot of different symptoms, and there's not a single biomarker that says, aha, this person's got Gulf War illness. But we do have a case definition, and we have been able to use it, and it did result in us circling the sick group and allowing us to advance the work. Like many chronic illnesses, it starts with this kind of thing. Is there a genetic predisposition? And then if so, what pulls the trigger? Genes are the gun, and the things in the environment are the trigger finger. So think about it that way. If you have the right gene, you might never see the thing that fires the gun. But in this case, the Gulf War gave you a fantastic array of things that could have fired that gun. And so triggering events happened. And then what we're doing now and ever since has been, can we fix it? Okay, what's causing it to persist? What are the mediators? What are the buttons that we can play around with in your healthy or unhealthy body to try to move it back towards a better state of health? And more, our focus and many of our focuses are trying to keep your brain healthy enough that you don't suffer additional consequences. Because as you're aging, a brain that has neuroinflammation is at higher risk for neurodegenerative illness. And we're trying to do studies that focus on ways to protect you so that you don't have another shoe drop down the road. So there are many different mediators. And because of this, and because we understand all these mediators more and more, you'll see in this conference that we're focused on the mediators. We broke up this conference into its subsets, and people will talk about what we've learned down there and how it's moving on to, and is already in clinical trial, and pushing all these different kinds of buttons. And I'm not going to go through them because I'm the intro speaker and I can't take up all the time. But I wanted to leave this on the screen, this slide on the screen long enough for you to see. But there is a web page at our university, Nova, that is specifically looking at Gulf War illness. I think if you Googled Nova, Southeastern University and Gulf War illness, it'd bring you right there. But here's the actual link. And there's a button there that says registry. What that is a little spot that gives us permission to let you know if there's an interesting study coming up. And we send out not just our studies that we're doing at Nova, we send out any studies that anyone that's in the field sends us. I think Beatrice sent me not long ago some information to send out to everybody in the registry, and we're organizing that for her right now. So Dr. Gollum. So we do this for folks that are trying to recruit their studies. The single largest barrier between our success in finding new answers and rolling out effective treatments at this point is finding study subjects to participate in our studies. I'm afraid the pandemic really put a chill on the enthusiasm of people that were previously really enthusiastic about working with in research. It's slowly waking up, like the bears waking up. But it has been really, really hard to recruit studies. And we have these studies now that are just kick-ass, amazing studies that hope to really give you powerful answers. Some of them are super simple. Some of them can be done from the comfort of your home. The phlebotomist comes out and draws a tube of blood, and we ship the medicines to you. That kind of study. Some of them are on site, much more complex, but really intensely meaningful, like the ones that Kim Sullivan's doing up there with her colleagues, looking at neuroimaging, and the other people are doing these types of studies as well. So it's so important that you help us help you by getting the word out about this and just passing on this link so that we can let people know what all is going on. So that is my slide. Oh, and this is just acknowledging that these are the institutions, and the CDRMP in particular. Thank you. The VA, thank you for continuing to support the work that we are all trying to do on your behalf. So again, gratitude. That we're incredibly grateful for your service and incredibly grateful that you're here today with us. And I think that that's the main thing I wanted to say. And then I'm going to segue to our first speaker. Lea Steele and I go way, way back. I'm going to say way back. I'm not going to, it was very early. It was before the Gulf War. And we were working on a different illness together in parallel worlds, doing work when she was at the CDC, if I remember right, doing work on the epidemiology of ME/CFS, chronic fatigue syndrome. But then we're all so lucky that she moved into this field, into the Gulf War area, because she has made some really pivotal, transformative insights to our field. And so I'm so grateful to her for being our first speaker to kick off this conference this year. Dr. Lea Steele is a neuro and environmental epidemiologist and a professor at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston. She works in collaboration across the country with many investigators. Her current Research includes studies of deployment factors that contributed to long-term health outcomes in veterans of the Persian Gulf War, as well as neurologic, immune, and genetic factors associated with Gulf War illness. Dr. Steele previously directed the Veterans Health Research Program at Baylor's University's Institute for Biomedical Studies. She served as scientific director of the Federal Research Advisory Committee on Gulf War Illness and was director of the Kansas Persian Gulf Veterans Health Initiative for the state of Kansas, which, by the way, gave us our case definition that we still lean heavily into today. She received her doctoral degree in epidemiology and human ecology at the University of Texas School of Public Health and investigated complex chronic illness as an epidemiology fellow at the U.S. Centers for Disease Control, the CDC in Atlanta. And that is a wonderful background. And we thank you, Lea, for being here today. I pass the torch.
Thank you very much, Dr. Klimas. And one, just thank you for hosting this event and having it every year. I think, as you describe it, it is an event of gratitude and also just to try to keep veterans informed about what we've learned and what we still have to figure out to help them feel better from this long-term illness. So as Dr. Klimas described, I'm going to start off the conference, provide sort of a big picture overview of historically what we've learned about Gulf War illness from population research. These are large studies of different populations of Gulf War veterans. And then we'll hone in a little bit more on what has been learned about associations between Gulf War illness and exposures during the Gulf War. And as you'll see, we've learned a lot. The studies converge in very consistent ways. So if there are things we are confident in knowing, and they do lay the foundation for the next steps that are still very important. So I'm going to just talk briefly about the Gulf War and the population research that's been done on Gulf War illness, and then we'll turn to the relationship to exposures during the Gulf War. So here we are, turn the clock back 34 years, as probably veterans in the audience know in great detail. In August of 1990, the large army and military operation of the country of Iraq invaded Kuwait. The world was aghast. Our president at the time said, "This will not stand." The UN got involved and a coalition started moving troops into the region. The U.S. had troops in the region within the week, and that was the beginning of Operation Desert Shield. So that went on for about 5 months, and in mid-January of 1991, the airstrikes began. And this was just a bombardment, the original shock and awe airstrikes. That went on for about 6 weeks. In late February, today is the 34th anniversary of the beginning of the ground war in the Gulf, as everyone who was there painfully recalls, I'm sure. This began on February 24th, 1991. And then, what do you know, in 4 days, mission accomplished, the war was over, ceasefire declared. So it was really a remarkable, decisive victory. Iraq was expelled from Kuwait. This involved a total of nearly 700,000 U.S. troops, 37 countries in the coalition, and as I say, 6 weeks of airstrikes and just 4 days of ground war. We haven't seen anything like this before or since. It was truly amazing. So thank you again to those who served for this great victory. And yet, despite the success of the war, we all heard, there were newspaper reports. We had a big story in the Houston Chronicle about it, of this illness that veterans were experiencing soon after the war. Persistent symptoms among returning veterans. This is a description from Allison Johnson's great book on Gulf War syndrome. And this condition at the time was called Gulf War syndrome. This is a staff sergeant in the Army. He said his symptoms began in the Gulf with severe abdominal cramping and severe diarrhea. He also had terrible headaches and bouts of dizziness and tingling. Once he returned to the base in Germany, the headaches persisted, and he experienced the cramps and diarrhea on a cyclic basis. He also went through periods of night sweats. And there were periods where he would sleep a lot because he was so fatigued. His joints were stiff. His knees would swell when he ran. It was harder for him to do things without feeling short of breath. That really pretty much describes it for a lot of veterans, these types of symptoms, and maybe a few more. And for him, the symptoms became worse as time went forward. All right, so that was, 34 years ago. Since that time, as Dr. Klimas alluded to, there have been so many studies that have been conducted, and we have learned a lot. We've been able to understand better what Gulf-4 illness looks like, who it affects at higher and lower rates, what the biology of Gulf-4 illness is to a large extent. And this comes initially from multiple large population studies of Gulf-4 veterans that have been done since the early 1990s. And Dr. Sullivan could tell us for sure, but I believe the Fort Devens study began in Fort Devens, Massachusetts in 1991. And they have followed those veterans since. There are also early studies in Indiana, Hawaii. CDC did a study of the Pennsylvania Air Guard. We did our study of Kansas veterans, many studies. And to this day, there are several large VA national studies still going on. The National Longitudinal Health Study of Gulf-4 era veterans from VA has followed the same group of veterans since 1995. And now recently, VA has started a new large study using their Million Veteran Program and looking at Gulf-4 and Gulf-4 era veterans in the Million Veteran Program. That study is focused on finding genetic associations with Gulf-4 illness. Besides the U.S. populations that have been studied, there have been, detailed population studies from the UK, Canada, Denmark, Australia, and Czechoslovakia. And given all these different populations evaluated at all these different points of time, it's really remarkable that we still see very consistent profile of symptoms that we now call Gulf-4 illness at different time points and different populations of veterans. So it's a very consistent profile, and I'll just briefly describe what that is. So by Gulf-4 illness, we mean this characteristic complex of symptoms. And symptoms, as you all know, are things that veterans can report. They describe what they're feeling, although we don't yet have diagnostic markers and widely effective treatments. But we do know what Gulf-4 illness looks like. These are different. The circles here are different symptom domains, different body systems in which we see symptoms. And these are just examples: pain symptoms, joint pain, muscle pain, neurological type symptoms, memory problems, difficulty concentrating, headaches, dizziness, things like that. Persistent fatigue that's not related to people that work too hard that day and they're just tired. GI symptoms, respiratory symptoms, and skin problems. Not only rashes, but these anomalous skin problems that we don't normally see. And I mean, as anyone knows, people have symptoms all the time. Individually, these symptoms are not particularly unusual. What is unusual is to have multiple symptoms in multiple domains at the same time, and they're quite severe, and they persisted now for decades in so many veterans. And not only that, when they started, they were affecting, one of the healthiest populations that you would ever see, troops who were healthy enough to deploy to war. They were quite healthy, and they come back with this profile of multiple symptoms that has now persisted so many years for many veterans. Okay, so again, trying to stay with the big picture, there were so many studies. I just want to share with you the take-home points that we've learned from these studies, and then later, if you want, we can give you some references if you'd like to see more of the details. But big picture, what we've learned from all these studies is that we see this symptom complex occurs at excess rates in every Gulf-4 veteran population that has been studied in the U.S. and also in some coalition countries, although not all. It appears to affect about 1/3 of the, roughly 700,000 U.S. personnel who served in the Gulf War. It's a little bit difficult to get the exact numbers because it varies with which case definition is used, and different case definitions are used for different purposes. Not only that, the case definitions were developed in the 1990s. So as veterans have developed more symptoms, it's a little harder to get precise numbers on how many people actually qualify as having Gulf-4 illness. We also see the highest rates of Gulf-4 illness consistently in Army veterans and Marine veterans, lower rates in Navy veterans and Air Force veterans. Now, this doesn't mean that Navy and Air Force veterans don't have Gulf-4 illness. They do, but they just have it at lower rates than veterans who serve in the Army and the Marine Corps. Also, we see highest rates in enlisted personnel, lower rates in officers, and we see highest rates in people who serve in forward areas of theater. By that, I mean people who served in areas where the active hostilities were, specifically in the studies, veterans, personnel who spent at least 7 days in Iraq and or Kuwait have higher rates of Gulf War illness compared to veterans who served further back in support areas or predominantly at sea during the war. So this is very consistent across studies. Now, we know that some veterans have developed ways to cope with their symptoms, have felt actually somewhat better over time, but as a whole, overall, looking at the population studies, it does appear that the number and severity of Gulf War illness symptoms has been increasing with time, along with other health conditions, other diagnoses that aren't Gulf War illness. So this is expected with aging. Diseases of aging have increased in Gulf War veterans, as with other veterans, and so have the accompanying symptoms. So that's just the big picture. All right. So as also Dr. Klimas alluded to, it's not just symptoms. We have many, many studies that have looked at Gulf War illness and consistently identified biological differences between veterans with Gulf War illness and veterans who don't have Gulf War illness. And the most consistent findings occur in the brain, both in the structure of the brain and in function of the brain. So testing to see how good cognitive function is, things like that. So Gulf War illness is associated with problems in the brain, problems in the immune and inflammatory processes. Again, this is very commonly found. And of great compelling interest is the fact that the inflammatory processes that we document most consistently occur in the brain. So no surprise. This is a lot of different types of evidence converging and pointing to this. And you'll hear some great presentations on this today. There are other types of biological, objectively measured differences that we see: GI abnormalities, autonomic nervous system dysregulation, neuroendocrine changes, things related to the adrenal gland and hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Some studies have shown differences in growth hormone. A number of studies have now identified problems with mitochondrial function. And also there are a broad number of studies that have looked at genetic factors that have made some people apparently more susceptible to developing Gulf War illness. So let's move on now from just what Gulf War illness looks like and what the biological correlates are to the big question of what caused Gulf War illness. And as we know, there are a lot of possibilities here. I mean, there are so many exposures that occurred during the Gulf War. Some of them are similar to other wars. Some are completely unique to the Gulf War. And over the years, people have put forth a long list of possible contributors or causes for Gulf War illness. This is not the long list, although it is a pretty long list. There are many possible causes and contributors to Gulf War illness. Let's just go through some of them, because basically I like to share pictures with you from the war. So, early on, I think a lot of people just said, well, this is some kind of stress reaction, Gulf War syndrome. It's the same thing that happens after every war. But the research did not bear that out. Definitely, the research did not link Gulf War illness strongly or consistently to serving in combat and other stressors during the war. So let's move on to some of the other possibilities here. The Kuwaiti oil well fires, there was a very jarring picture that Dr. Klimas just shared. And as you see, in the daytime, this is how the sky looked. It was dark. It was so polluted. It was just unbelievable. Over 600 of these burning wells were set as the Iraqis were moving back from Kuwait. And these wells burned between February and November 1991. So the last well was put out in November 1991. So you can clearly see what a serious exposure this was. And just almost, I can't think of anything comparable to this. It's just tremendous. Another exposure that was, although not completely unique to the Gulf War, the level of exposure and the widespread nature of the exposure is unique to the Gulf War. And this relates to the chemical weapons exposures. I know veterans on the ground heard chemical alarms quite often. A lot of the incidents where chemicals were released in theater were documented. Some were also confirmed. But overall, there were multiple incidents at different times, beginning largely in mid-January of 1991, when we started bombing Iraq, and this included bombing their chemical weapons facilities. So there are a lot of confirmations of exposures during that period of the released chemicals coming across the border. But the most documented and studied incident relates to chemical weapons exposures at the Comicia pit demolitions. This was in March of 1991, after the ceasefire. So after the ceasefire, coalition forces, mostly U.S., went into an area in southeastern Iraq, near the location of Comicia, where there was a large weapons, munitions bunker there, several football fields in size, and we just destroyed the weapons in those bunkers. And come to find out afterwards that there were nerve agents in those weapons, and they made clouds of smoke in the air that then came down for days over our own troops. And so in this picture, you see a DoD model that the green cloud here is where the smoke was going on March 10th of 1991. All the little red dots are where different units were located, U.S. units, mostly Army. And so you see it came down across southeastern Iraq, came across the border, and Saudi Arabia, came into Kuwait. So the DoD estimates that as many as 100,000 troops were exposed to low levels of nerve agents as a result of this one incident, or were potentially exposed. It's really hard to know exactly what individuals were exposed and which were not. But there was potential exposure to as many as 100,000 U.S. troops. Now, here's another exposure of concern, pyridostigmine bromide, or NAT pills. These were little blister packets of white pills. There were 21 pills. They lasted a week. You were supposed to take them 3 times a day when ordered by unit command, and these were hoped and taken to protect you from adverse effects of nerve agent exposure. The story didn't turn out exactly that way, but again, this is one of the exposures that is unique to the Gulf War. It's still part of DoD policy to use this pill, the pyridostigmine bromide pill, but they haven't been widely distributed since the Gulf War. And then lastly, just the airborne particulates and the sandstorms. I imagine this looks familiar to some of you who were there. The levels of particulates are highest in this region than anywhere else in the whole world. And at certain times, the sandstorms make the sand just so dense. And then there's something called the Shamal winds certain times of the year where it's just as incredibly sandy in the air and makes breathing very difficult. A lot of people, just from the sand alone, get all kinds of symptoms after they serve in the region. There were all kinds of biting insects and sandflies and sand fleas that carried all kinds of diseases and infections that, American troops didn't have immunity to. So because there was great concern in the military, based on earlier military campaigns where some of these diseases took out troops at higher rates than actual battles, so the military provided a large number of pesticides that were heavily used during the Gulf War. This table is from a DoD report. They reported that at least 64 different pesticide products were used during the Gulf War. They identified 15 pesticides and repellents of concern, and this is the list. And they've documented overuse of these pesticides among thousands and thousands of personnel. Okay, so as I mentioned, there's a lot of things that could have caused Gulf War illness, a lot of things that might have caused Gulf War illness, but what does the evidence tell us? What are the most likely causes of Gulf War illness overall in the large populations? Anything could have caused a problem in an individual, but we want to know overall what are the most, does the evidence fall to tell us the risk factors for Gulf War illness. And I'll just summarize it this way. It can summarize into three groups. And that long list of exposures, the top group in green here are the exposures for which evidence consistently identifies a significant link with Gulf War illness. So in these many large population studies, very consistently identify pyridostigmine bromide, pesticide exposures, and low-level nerve agent exposure as associated with the highest rates of Gulf War illness across different populations. Okay, that's one group of exposures. There's another group, middle group of exposures that include in yellow here, oil well fire smoke, large number of vaccines, having a TBI during deployment, combinations of exposures. For these exposures, it's less clear. It appears to have caused some problems in some people, but this doesn't show up in studies consistently. For example, only a few British studies have shown problems among veterans who took the largest number of vaccines. It doesn't show up in other studies. And there's just not enough evidence for us to make firm conclusions on these exposures. And then lastly, there's a group of experiences and exposures during the Gulf War that there's little or no evidence of association with Gulf War illness. So in this group are psychological stressors, depleted uranium, this anthrax vaccine specifically, fuels and solvents, and sand and particulates. While some of these have caused some problems, not necessarily Gulf War illness. The sand and particulates have been associated with asthma and other respiratory conditions. Overall, these exposures have been evaluated extensively in population studies, and there's little evidence that they are one of the primary contributors to Gulf War illness, just based on the evidence we have from many, many studies. So, okay, let's move on. So just to summarize that, of the many exposures of possible concern, the most consistently identified risk factors for Gulf War illness are use of pyridostigmine bromide, and specifically for veterans who use the PD pills for a week or longer at the highest risk of Gulf War illness, prolonged exposure to pesticides, sometimes overuse of pesticides, and then the low-level exposure to nerve agents. And the reason it's important to sort of summarize this is because each of these three types of exposures are potentially neurotoxicants. And a large proportion of the compounds in these groups fall into a certain class of chemicals called acetylcholinesterase inhibitors, things like organophosphates and carbamates, as Dr. Primus mentioned. And they all act on, they have multiple actions, but they act specifically on one neurotransmitter in the brain and nervous system. So we'll actually hear a little bit more about this from animal studies, I think, today. So let's just pull it all together here. Just based on all this research that we've covered in the 34 years since the war, we have learned the following bullet points. Gulf War illness affects about 1/3 of nearly 700,000 U.S. veterans who served in the war. The highest rates are consistently found in those who were enlisted versus officers during the war, in ground troops, that is Army and Marines, and in veterans who were forward deployed during the war. Beyond just symptoms, studies have also identified brain, immune, and other biological changes in veterans with Gulf War illness compared to veterans who don't have Gulf War illness or who didn't serve in the Gulf War. The highest risk exposures during the war were the anti-nerve gas pills, or PD, the pesticide exposures, and the low-level nerve agent exposures. The studies also did not indicate overall that Gulf War illness is the result of combat stress or psychological factors. There are also something that I won't go into detail on just because of the time. There are multiple indications of genetic variability that may appear to have made some veterans more susceptible or less susceptible to some of the exposures during the Gulf War. If we do have a little time, I do have a slide I can share. But in the meantime, I'll just thank you now for your attention, and I'll be around later for any questions.
I wanted to thank you so much. Lee, that was excellent. A great beginning to this excellent conference today.